the Museum of Curiosity. Hello, my name's John Lloyd and I'm the Professor of Ignorance at the University of Buckingham. Welcome to the Museum of Curiosity and this, the final acquisition meeting of Gallery 2. Joining me, as ever, is the man known to museum curators the world over as the museum curator's museum curator. It's the museum's curator, Mr. Sean Locke. Thank you. So, Mr. Curator, what's been happening in the museum this week?
Well, John, seeing as it's the last show in the series, I thought I'd submit my expenses. Just a few sundry items. I'm claiming £5,000 for clothes, because I can't come to work naked. £800 for a bed, otherwise I'll be tired at work. And 300 grand for dry rot.
Well, approved.
Thank you.
Well, now, let's first take down the particulars of this week's steering committee. Clive James, Tim Minchin and Philip Pullman. Well, now, the museum is honoured but slightly nervous to welcome Philip Pullman, who has been described as the most dangerous author in Britain. As a children's author, he's won every major writing award conceivable, and his most famous work, his Dark Materials trilogy, has not only won the Carnegie Medal, but the Carnegie of Carnegies, chosen by readers from all the books that have won the prize in its 70-year history. Philip, how dangerous are you?
I'm not dangerous at all. That was a quote from Peter Hitchens, who was professionally outraged once a week on subjects chosen presumably at random. And he came up with this quote, which pleased me enormously, and it pleased the publishers of the paperback edition as well, because it went on the cover, and I think it helped me sell several copies. So I'm most grateful to him. It's preposterous, of course.
The Archbishop of Canterbury apparently says that your book should be part of the syllabus.
Well, he's quite right, of course. He's right on many things.
Now, you were a teacher, weren't you?
Yes, I was a teacher for about 12 years, a school teacher. And but I did learn how to tell stories because I taught at a time before the national curriculum had come in.
So you taught what you liked?
I taught what I liked, and what I liked to do was telling stories.
And where did you teach literature, English literature?
Yes, that's what I was paid to do. Yeah. And I learned a great deal about telling stories doing that. I learned how to time a story and how to pace it and how to... You learn what sort of storyteller you are. I can't do funny. I'm not a funny storyteller. But I can make people want to know what happened next, that sort of thing.
So, do you have some pretty strong views about the way education is going at the moment?
Yes, I do. It's far too regulated. Young teachers now think that the way you teach is to follow a set of instructions. And that shouldn't be the case. They should be free to be enthusiastic. They should take their enthusiasm, their hobbies, their eccentricities, their knowledge into the classroom with them and make full use of it.
One of my kids was not doing very well in English, and the teacher said he just doesn't seem to get subject, verb, object, as if that would be such an exciting thing to tell somebody that they always remember it.
But it does raise the point of whether the pupils should learn grammar. I mean, if you think they should, the question is, how do you actually teach that?
They should all learn Latin. That's my prescription. They should all learn Latin.
Well, there's a flying start. That'll go over a bomb in almost...
Yeah, it will, yeah.
I've got a book about grammar by my bed, and I'm now, at 30, teaching myself what I already know how to speak. That's a bad sentence. I don't know what... I don't know... I didn't know grammar. No. I'm finding it hard to talk at all now. But you know, if you have a joy of stories and language, you'll find that stuff later. Yeah,
and actually school is too late. The place to start giving children a joy of language is with nursery rhymes when they're too young to sit up. Yeah. On a parent's lap. That's the place where they learn that language is fun and it's not threatening and they're not being told to do something.
My 2.5-year-old
it's just fun.
Doesn't get dinner unless she asks for it in Latin. She's a tiny, skinny little thing, but sharp as a whip.
Lastly, Philip, time for a Museum of Curiosity exclusive. Can you tell us a little bit about your latest book, the yet-to-be-published Book of Dust?
No, I can't tell you a thing about it, and I'm not going to, because I'm superstitious. Superstitious about talking about the things I'm writing. It evaporates, you know. It's like opening the back of the camera to see if that metaphor means nothing these days, does it?
Ladies and gentlemen, Philip Pullman.
And it was a simile anyway.
The next member of our steering committee is Tim Minchin, an actor, comedian and musical entertainer whose songbook includes the titles A Peace Anthem for Palestine, You Grew on Me Like a Tumour, and the beautiful love song he wrote for his wife, If I Didn't Have You, Someone Else Would Do. Tim, I read that when you wrote that song, If I Didn't Have You, Someone Else Would Do, you had to explain it to your wife.
Yeah, she took a while to come around to that one. But the song, as I explain on stage, is about maths, not about love. People's notion that they're fatalistically connected to a soulmate is fatally flawed. Obviously, the slightest butterfly wing flap at some early point in your life would have changed everything. But the fact that it is just a mathematical chance that you're with your loved one doesn't make it less valuable. But it's hilarious.
There's a line in here, I think you're special, but you fall within a bell curve.
Yeah.
So it's a very intelligent, romantic song, this.
Yeah. And it's wonderful sort of relationship diplomacy, because I don't mention where within the bell curve she lies.
But it says here, Tim, that your shows divide people, that they're supposed to be controversial. Do you go out to divide people?
No, not at all. But every now and then I get angry letters and stuff, and of all the letters I get, probably the most frequent, why are you doing material about religion? It's not clever or funny. And I kind of agree. I'm not very comfortable watching comedians do religion as a subject, simply because it always strikes me as a little petulant. I would, however, say that religion must always be mocked until it is completely out of government and schools.
I like this quote from Calvin and Hobbes. It's hard to be religious when certain people are never incinerated by bolts of lightning. Lastly, you used to have a band, or do you still have a band called Timmy the Dog?
I had a band, no, I don't still. I had a band called Timmy the Dog because I thought that's kind of a kitsch pop reference to a children's book character, but lots of people I realised hadn't read Enid Blyton's Famous Five and just thought I was calling myself Timmy the Dog, and I was some sort of hip-hop band, and that was one of many, many band names.
Timmy doesn't sound very South Central LA, does it?
No, that's right, yeah.
But Timmy the Dog, your first album in 2001 was called what?
Sit. It was a dance album, you know.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Minchin. Clive James is an author, journalist, critic, TV presenter and poet who has been described as a great bunch of guys, and is probably most famous for filling our newspapers with such sharp observations as this, his description of Arnold Schwarzenegger as a brown condom full of walnuts.
The essential word there is brown, because when he was starting off as a bodybuilder, he had this permatan, you know? So it was a brown condom. Yeah. There's something particularly depressing about that.
Horrid. One other description I've always particularly liked, Clive, is your description of Barbara Cartland's face.
The corpses of two crows that had flown into a chalk cliff, was it?
So, you've done all these different things, Clive. Is there something about expat Aussies like you and Germaine Greer and Barry Humphries and Rolf Harris that you have these kind of eclectic careers?
I think it's just hunger, you know. We thought back in the early 60s that Australia was a bit of a backwater and you should go abroad and get everything, you know, to eat the world. And the habit was slow to die. Even now, I still want to do more things, you know, and I still feel I'm just beginning, which is a very, very silly thing to feel for a man who's turning 70 this year.
Well, you don't look it, Clive.
Thank you.
This, does he?
I look 80, I know that. Yeah.
Do you think there's a particular Australian sense of humour that's different to the British one?
I think there is an exuberance of language, a sheer revelling in the noises that the human mouth can make, as it were.
If you ever nasal comedy.
Yeah, if you ever listen to Australian Parliament, you'll hear... I wonder if the member for Whoop Whoop realises he's a drongo. So you don't hear that in the Houses of Parliament.
Mr. Speaker!
When I was starting off, there were about half a dozen people in the whole world who could go on stage and do an hour of stand-up. And it just grew and grew and grew until now a very large proportion of the entire population of the earth are stand-up comedians.
Yes,
Doing 3-hour sets without a break.
And in Edinburgh, you know, you've been there recently, haven't you?
Well, what's incredible about Edinburgh is if you go walk around the streets of Edinburgh during the festival, there's so many posters with genius on.
Yeah.
Right, there's so many geniuses. It's probably the greatest period in human history.
in the
It's just a shame they're focused on comedy and not curing cancer and ways of transportation without oil.
Well, now, Philip, you're a bit of an honorary Australian because you spent some of your childhood there, didn't you?
Well, very little. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, we spent 18 months there, so it's not very long. And this was in 1956. We lived in Adelaide before there was television. Everything came to us on the radio. And the other thing I remember about Australia is American comics. I first saw Superman and Batman comics in Australia, and I loved it. And that was the greatest gift that Australia gave to me, I think.
And you thought that Batman was an Australian from then on, huh?
One Batman.
Lastly, Clive, I understand you were christened Vivian.
I was christened Vivian James, which was a boy's name. That was 1939. And then Gone with the Wind came out, and Vivian Lee was in it, and suddenly Vivian was a girl's name. And I got into terrible trouble at school. Got beaten up every day. Eventually I cracked and I asked my mother, Mum, can I have a new name? And she said, well, you have to pick one out. And we went to the movies one night, and there was a movie up there on the screen with a character called Clive. And I said, I like that. Can I be called Clive? And she said, yes, dear, you may. So I changed my name to Clive, and I got beaten up again every day because I was the only Clive in Australia. There were no others.
Ladies and gentlemen, Clive James. Now, the time has come for the museum to assume its customary posture in readiness to accept our guest donations, Mr. Curator.
Yes, thank you, Professor. The museum is now in the receive position. Clive, what would you like to donate to the museum?
I'd like to donate a North American P-51D Mustang fighter aircraft from 1945 in its full and perfect 8th Air Force livery. It was beautiful. It was accidentally beautiful, and it was a war winner. And in truth, no single weapon ever wins a war. But if ever there was a symbol of winning the war, it was the P-51. And when it appeared over Berlin in 1944, it wasn't supposed to be there. No fighter aircraft was meant to fly that far. Goering was in front of the Air Ministry in the Wilhelmstrasse, and he looked up and he saw it, and he knew the war was lost. It came into being because the British Purchasing Commission showed up in America and said, look, old boy, we want a fighter that's a bit better than the Spitfire and the Hurricane. We'd like your Curtiss Tomahawk. And the North American corporation said, we can do better than that. And in 117 days, they designed the Mustang. And the first version of it was 15 miles an hour faster than the Spitfire, but it, unfortunately only up to 15,000 feet. The second version, the one we're talking about now, the P-51D, notice that D, it was fast all the way up to 30,000 feet because it had a two-stage supercharger and it had a British engine. The aircraft went faster than any British plane that had the Merlin because of the Mustang's design. It had all kinds of stuff that no aircraft had ever had before. It had 6 50-caliber machine guns on it that could tear a Focke-Wulf 190 in half. And this thing could fly from East Anglia all the way to Berlin and back. The Germans were astonished. It even dealt with German jets. Chuck Yeager was flying a P-51 when he shot down a Messerschmitt 262 twin-engine jet fighter. But not only did it astonish the Germans, it astonished Britain. And it was the beginning of the story of American technology taking supremacy, a subject we're still dealing with, as a matter of fact, because the British found it very, very hard to match. But what fascinates me, it was a tremendous work of art. And just by accident, if you set out to design the aircraft to do this job, it comes out looking like this poetic thing.
Roy Lichtenstein's painting Wham! Is that a Mustang?
That's a Mustang, yes.
So it's an iconic plane, because the Ford Mustang, the car's called after the plane.
Absolutely true, yes. The P-51 got called Mustang because the British called it that, and the Americans decided that they would go along with it.
It is slightly embarrassing because due to a series of complicated typing errors, our research people researched not the P-51 Mustang, but the P-38 Lightning.
Let me tell you about the P-38 Lightning.
Finally.
It was a twin-engined aircraft with Allison engines, and it had a very high performance. The American had 3 high-performance fighter planes. They had the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the P-51 Mustang. The Thunderbolt was very, very fast, as fast as the Mustang, especially going downhill, because it was enormous. But it didn't have the range of the P-51. It couldn't go to Berlin. The P-38 could do everything, but it was too complicated. 2 engines meant twice as much trouble. But if you want me to talk more about the P-38, I'm perfectly willing to.
That's extraordinary. He's completely unprompted. He really does know. I knew this because I've got it written down, but he's never... Who was Dick Bong, Clive?
Richard Bong was the top-scoring US fighter pilot in the Pacific area.
Oh, and, how does he know this?
I have little-known facts about all kinds of aircraft. When I was a child, I not only thought all this was fascinating, I made a huge mistake. I thought other people would find it fascinating. Especially my mother, who I wore out. She was semi-conscious as she listened to this stuff.
Have you ever flown? Have you ever trained as a pilot?
I myself can't fly now, but I love being flown. I've been in many, many types of aircraft. The airliners are getting less interesting as they get better, as it were. The 747 is actually a beautiful aircraft. The 747 on the ground doesn't look all that big because its proportions are so fine. It's actually proportioned like an F-86 Saberjet. The F-86 Saberjet was the jet that superseded the P-51 Mustang in first-line service after World War II. It too was built by North American and had the same canopy. Very important to talk about the bubble canopy on the P-51. Can I go on?
Well, you're not telling... It's not news to me, but for other people it'll be...
Well, we can't possibly fit all the planes you've mentioned, Clive, into the museum.
I've just begun.
But we certainly accept, Clive, your suggestion of the P-51 Mustang. And here's one coming right now into the museum. There you are.
I don't know, that sounded more like a 38 to me.
So, Tim...
Yes, Sean?
What the heck have you brought into the museum?
I would like to donate the notion of tempting fate.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to me because I fancy myself quite a sort of, what's the word?
Superstitious?
No, the opposite. Rational kind of person. And I've always been intrigued by humans' tendency to endow themselves with superpowers. A lot of us believe that we can influence the physical world using nothing but the powers of our mind. Things like prayer and karma and the secret and stuff is very pervasive. I've always been quite contemptuous of people who think that they can influence the exterior world with their telekinetic minds. But I realised recently that I still have some sort of leftovers of superstitions, specifically the tempting fate ones, the idea that I shouldn't say something like, oh, this tour is going great, I haven't had a cold. If I said something like that, the compulsion to apologise for it or to touch wood or something was still there. So I finally got over that. In fact, the thing that came up for me recently is in my latest show, I have a song that I wrote for a newspaper critic who very early in my career wrote an extremely scathing review of me. And I've got this song. I name him, his proper name in the song. I've never managed to get the song on the BBC. But basically, I wish upon him all this stuff. And it's been interesting for me because of all the things I've written about, people are quite shocked by it, that I would dare say these things out loud. People seem to think that I would feel some sense of guilt. And that's a very interesting, quite primitive idea, isn't it? It's a witch doctory idea, but it's strangely pervasive even in our highly educated scientific Western world. So because I finally shed myself of the notion of tempting fate, I'm donating it to your museum.
I think it's very interesting. My one comment is the alternative to the world you're talking about is us all going round going, I hope all your family die this week. I hope your leg gets chopped off. You know,
This is a good world. I like the sound of this world.
You like this world. We're going wishing ill on each other. It's a very interesting idea. It's like the idea that we do influence things. Like, for example, they're not walking under a ladder.
Yeah.
I still don't walk under a ladder.
No.
I just think, why risk it?
Well, exactly.
We don't know.
Here's an interesting statistic. Walking under a ladder is the third most popular superstition. 49% of people in the country avoid walking under ladders.
It's also common sense, because people drop things when they're up ladders, don't they?
That's where the superstition comes from.
Yeah.
But that's not the reason. Yeah. I deliberately walk under ladders all the time.
Yeah, that's it. It's very empowering.
I always do it. The top one is touching wood. 86% of people touch wood.
Do you know what I'm going to do?
You're not
I'm going to set a ladder up in my street,
yeah,
and I'm going to climb up it with loads of buckets of paint. And every cocky so-and-so that walks under my ladder, I'm going to go, oh, really? Fate doesn't affect you? And I'm going to chuckle.
Philip, are you a superstitious person at all?
Yeah, I am superstitious, quite irrationally so, but I'm quite happy to be irrational about this. My model here is the great scientist Niels Bohr, who had a horseshoe nailed up outside his laboratory, and somebody said, "You don't believe in that, do you?" And he said, "No, but they tell me it works whether you believe in it or not." I always greet magpies, for example. I say good morning to them, or good afternoon, or whatever.
There are grey areas here, right? Because, for example, not talking about your book, you might, by speaking about it, release your sense of its privacy and of its magic. Whereas I'm trying to take control of this instinct to think that our thoughts can change the world.
But
Obviously,
I'm not sure about this. I mean, in quantum mechanics, looking at things alone has more effect on things than you might expect.
Well, looking at things can have a profound effect on happenings. The curse of hello has been scientifically established by quantum mechanics to be true. Within minutes of any couple appearing in Hello magazine celebrating their perfect wedding, those two will be divorced. It's well known. You know?
Tim, what would you like in the room of tempting fate? What would you say?
You could probably put a bit of wood in a room with a dismembered hand on an axle constantly knocking it.
But what about...
Or you could have a body lying there with a collapsed ladder on top of it.
Yeah.
And a workman nodding his head wisely, couldn't you?
And a priest going, "I told you so."
That's the concept of tempting fate. Thank you very much.
So, Philip, we're moving on to your submission. What have you brought for us?
Well, I brought a category rather than one single object. It starts for me with this elegant piece of brass rod. It's about 1 foot long, and it's worn smooth through use, and each of the ends of the rod is hammered flat into a sort of paddle shape. One end is bent back on itself at a right angle, so the whole thing looks like an elongated letter L. Now, I bought this in a second-hand tool shop. I like tools, and I buy a lot of them. And the chap in the shop didn't know what this was for, but he sold it to me for a couple of quid. And I took it home. And shortly after that, a woodworking magazine asked me to contribute a piece for their feature of my 10 favourite tools, you see, which turns out every month.
Sorry for sniggering. It's just...
I forgive you. And so I wrote about my block plane and my Japanese saws and so on. And I included this because, having fiddled with it for a while, I discovered a use for it. And I said I didn't know what this was originally for. And somebody wrote in and said, it's a sand mould tamper. In the days when they did metalwork with moulding things in sand, you use the flat end for tamping down the sand in the mould, you see. And I thought that was very interesting, because what I used it for is the best instrument ever devised for scratching your back. And that set me thinking about things that were invented for one purpose but are now used for another. And, of course, my mind leapt immediately to the @ symbol on the computer keyboard, or the typewriter keyboard. And it was used for making out bills. Retailers or wholesalers would write out a bill saying, to Mr. Lloyd, a dozen cases of claret at 17 and 6pence a case. Until somebody decided that they needed something to indicate to a computer that a particular string of letters was an email address. So the @ symbol is the symbol over this case. It's things that were invented for one purpose but are used for another. And my third example is nitroglycerin, which was invented in the 19th century for blowing up mountains and is now used in medicine. The early people who were working on it developed awful blinding headaches. They discovered that this stuff gave off fumes which act as vasodilators and expand the veins in your head or something. And with further experimentation, discovered that it was very good for relieving the symptoms of angina. So there you are, things that were invented for one purpose and are now used for another.
That's really... I certainly didn't know that about nitroglycerin, did you, Sean?
Yeah.
When they first gave it to people for their symptoms, they had to give it another name. I think they called it glyceryl trinitrate, because they didn't want people thinking that they would suddenly disintegrate into a heap of giblets and bone splinters.
Well, heroin was originally marketed as a cough mixture.
Well, Sigmund Freud used to give cocaine to his patients.
Yeah.
Gave them cocaine. He said, "Here, take this. You're going to feel better." And guess what? They did.
Many drugs do this. Warfarin, for example, was invented as a rat killer. And it's a very good anticoagulant, because that's how it kills the rats.
Wolverine?
Warfarin, the drug. So it's a very big category, this.
It is a big category.
Apparently cornflakes were invented to stop people masturbating. No, I imagine you've got the box in one hand, the spoon in the other, and then there's the milk. You're just busy. No, apparently it's Kellogg. Kellogg. Kellogg created it. You know, Kellogg was obsessed with
freak,
manners
yeah.
and health, and he felt that sexual expression was something that was quite unhealthy for you. That's why he actually created cornflakes. You know, I don't tell my kids that.
Well, look, for example, here's another example. Play-Doh was originally a wallpaper cleaner.
Oh! I once used the hubcap of a British Bedford Dormobile as an ashtray because I smoked a lot, you know, and not even I could fill up the hubcap of a British Bedford Dormobile. That is the story of how I used a hubcap of a British Bedford as an ashtray.
I was just saying there ought to be a name for the @ symbol because in other languages they have them.
What are they called?
Well, in Spain, it's a very old word called the arroba, which is used for hundreds of years and means a 25-pound weight in Spanish. In Czech, they call it the roll mop or the pickled herring.
Yeah.
In Hebrew, it's the strudel. And in Finnish, it's the cat's tail or the meow sign, which is rather charming, isn't it? These are all in their respective languages.
I've got one more object, if we've got time to put in this category,
course.
and this is the human appendix, which has evolved in all of us for no reason that we can see. It so clearly hasn't got a purpose. It's no good at all. It goes septic. You go to hospital. It's horrible. What is it for? Well, in the optimistic spirit of the Museum of Curiosity, I'm betting that one day we will discover what it's for, and there must be somewhere in nature the problem to which the appendix is the perfect solution.
Maybe it's Clive's new ashtray.
Clive's new ashtray.
So let's hear it for the @ symbol. There we go. And so that's it for the last 3 acquisitions of Gallery 2 in the museum. A tiny little squiggle, the concept of fate, inevitably, and a winged Mustang with arms. We hope you'll be hearing from us again soon, and in the meantime, I leave you with this comforting thought from Calvin, the great 6-year-old philosopher of Calvin and Hobbes, who said, "I think we dream so we don't have to be apart so long. If we're in each other's dreams, we can play together all night." Thank you. That's all from the Museum of Curiosity.
The Museum of Curiosity was curated by John Lloyd and Sean Locke, with research by QI's James Harkin and Molly Oldfield. The exhibits were donated by Clive James, Philip Pullman and Tim Minchin, and the producers were Richard Turner and Dan Schreiber. If you're the curious sort and you'd like to snoop around the museum's exhibits and prod them, please make your way to the Radio 4 website, where you can find out more about the Museum of Curiosity.